The subject today is the story of Apollo. And the big question here is, why did we actually go to the moon? And you might have heard many things about this, but fundamentally, the Apollo mission was a huge event in history. It'll be remembered for thousands of years, but it has meant absolutely nothing since we actually went to the moon. It affects your life in no way. Another event from 1969, say Woodstock, matters way more to you right now than this does. So why did we go? So, the first thing you hear is people say, oh, we went because of science. That is not true at all. It's not remotely true. It was terrible for science. Because we spent $116 billion on the Apollo program. That's a lot of money. In fact, a historian calculated what you could buy with that money. One of the few times they're useful. So you could give every teacher in the U.S. a 10% raise. You could give $70 million, this is in 2013 dollars, to the top 200 colleges in the country. You could give 50,000 freshmen full scholarships through PhD in the sciences. You could make 10 new medical schools. You could build 53... That would. Not smart as historian. You can make 53 completely new, build and endow these 53 new world-class universities, 3 more permanent Rockefeller foundations, and have $1 billion left just to popularize science. Furthermore, Apollo didn't make a lot of sense because we send lunar rovers now to do stuff, which are not only more efficient cost-wise, but they also do a much better job because they can be there for a much longer period of time. So really the only thing we got out of science from the Apollo program is a bunch of lunar rocks, which is awesome if you're a lunar geologist, but for everyone else it means nothing. Science is not a good reason to go to the moon. Now the second reason you hear a lot about are the ever-present dirty commies, which is also not a good reason to go to the moon. The main reason this didn't work is because the Soviets sucked at building big rockets. The picture there is of the N-1 rocket. That was their alternative to the Saturn V. They wanted to go to the moon in that bad boy, but it had a very nasty habit of just exploding in giant fireballs. Actually, the biggest non-nuclear explosion of all time was one of these puppies blowing up on the launch pad. And it happened 4 times in a row. So they gave up very quickly, and we knew that, actually. It wasn't a race at all. We were competing against ourselves. Now, the third reason is that of America, that we went to the moon because America's the best. And while that may be true, that is not a good reason to go to the moon. For the simple reason that Americans did not like Apollo. Before 1969, when we actually landed on the moon, the majority of Americans were against the Apollo program. Maybe because if you spent 1/3 of the Apollo budget, you'd lift every American out of poverty. So it's kind of a waste of money. And in fact, this is not often mentioned, but before the Apollo 11 launch, there were protesters, anti-poverty protesters at the launch. And instead of trying to shoo them away, NASA was smart. They gave them free food and a front row seat to the launch. And they never complained again. They're as happy as children. So if those things are not good explanations for going to the moon, why did we go? And this is kind of the rest of the presentation. So first, let's talk about what the moon landing actually was. What was this whole program about? Well, first thing, it was the biggest technological achievement humans have ever made, I would argue. We went from the Model T Ford in 1908 to driving cars on the surface of the moon in 63 years. That's incredible. It's unprecedented, that scale of technical achievement. Second of all, the moon landing is unique in that it's a situation, the only situation in history, where a government spent a large amount of money on a project that was not infrastructure-based or technologically, scientifically important, like the Manhattan Project. We actually spent 5 times more money on the moon landing than we did on building an atomic bomb. And atomic bombs matter way more than just putting someone on the moon. Ultimately, all we did was put someone on the moon and got them back to Earth safely. Which is cool, but it also is really, really difficult. So now I want to go through how the odds of doing this are just so low. I want to talk about how difficult this actually was. And you have to go back to 1903 with the Wright brothers. Now this was kind of the first step towards the moon, when 2 high school dropouts from Ohio, that were bicycle mechanics, coaxed this airplane barely above the ground and recorded the first flight. what many people don't know is that this was not a monumental occasion. They actually had to work for another decade to convince people that they were not frauds. Also, fun fact, there are more astronauts from Ohio than any other state in the Union. Thus proved like a vastly disproportionate number. No one knows why. But my theory is because people from Ohio want to get as far away as they can from Ohio. Now, the second really important person event is this guy. His name is Robert Goddard. And many people don't know who he is and what he's done, but he actually was the father of modern rocketry. A really big deal. He discovered you can use liquids to propulse a rocket, and he was the first person to suggest actually putting a rocket into space and going to the moon. Naturally, he was a genius, but people thought he was a lunatic. Like, really, really crazy lunatic. In fact, there was a New York Times editorial that just slammed him, saying he, quote, lacked the knowledge ladled out daily in high schools. They refused to believe, the New York Times, that a rocket could work in the vacuum of space. They were very, very wrong. And in 1969, the day after the Apollo 11 mission was launched, they published a retraction saying, "The time regrets the error." Yeah, understatement of quite a while. Now, the third person is this guy, handsome-looking fellow. His name is Wernher von Braun. He is a genius. He created the Saturn V rocket. He really was the other founding father of modern rocketry with Goddard. In fact, almost nothing is bad about this guy. People loved him. He was a genius. He really created the Apollo program. The only failing he had was that he was a Nazi. He was a legitimate, bona fide Nazi. And he wasn't just a Nazi, he was a member of the SS, which means he was a super Nazi. And he used slave labor during World War II to build his rockets. Not so good. The Americans captured him as a part of the Operation Paperclip, brought him to America, and had him run the rocket program in rural Alabama. I'm not real sure how that went, but probably didn't go super well, mixing Nazi German with Alabama. But ultimately, he recanted his Nazi views, and we're kind of okay with him being an American now because he did a lot of good things. So, you have frauds, a crazy person, and a Nazi, and then you finish it out with JFK. And if you have talked to me, you might know that I hate JFK. He was a terrible president, just was horrible. The only reason his legacy is good is because he was shot. And he, in '61, he said, we should go to the moon in the State of the Union. And I'm convinced that he had no idea how hard this would actually be. And if he knew, he would have never said that, because it was a terrible idea. But in typical American fashion, blind optimism and just naive good luck actually worked out. All right, so how did we actually do this? How did we go to the moon? The first thing to note is that no computers were used to design any part of the moon mission. One small computer was used to get there, but it wasn't used in designing it. Literally everything it took to go to the moon was pencil, paper, and slide rules, which if you don't know what that is, that's what came before calculators. Nothing as much as a pocket calculator was used in going to the moon, which is incredible. So there are a couple key components of going to the moon. The first was the Saturn V rocket, which was a sight to behold by all accounts. It was basically a skyscraper full of explosives that were controlled. It was 363 feet tall. That's a pretty tall building. It was gigantic. 160 million horsepower meant it was the most powerful machine ever created. Not just rocket. This is the most powerful machine in the history of Earth. Another fun fact is that it got a miles per gallon. Well, it got a fuel economy of 5 inches per gallon. So a lot of fuel was burned with this bad boy. To underscore how powerful it was, when they tested the engine, just one engine in rural Alabama near Huntsville, they kept having problems with shattering glass windows in downtown Huntsville, which was miles away. It was just that powerful, and the amount of exhaust actually created its local weather patterns. Like it rained because they fired this engine on a certain day. That's how powerful it was. So it was incredible machine. The second key component was the lunar lander, and this was the first true spaceship. It was designed to operate only in space, and only did operate in space. But that produces something of a problem, because you can't really test something that's designed to be used only in space on Earth. And so they created the little thing on the right, which was like a simulator, except real life. The only problem was that they built 5 of them, and only 2 of them are left because they crashed the other 3 because it was so hard to pilot, including one time that almost killed Neil Armstrong. So not like real encouraging for the lunar program when you can't test what you actually want to use, and what you can test doesn't work. And the final piece was the guidance computer. This was beyond state-of-the-art. It was like the most incredible computer of the era. And they used 2 things. The thing on the left is called an inertial guidance unit. And it was basically a gyroscope that was really, really precise. In fact, it was so precise the women building it couldn't wear makeup. Because if even a little speck of makeup got into the mechanics of the thing, it would be completely off and they would miss the moon. It's that precise. Now, the computer is its own kind of special thing. It was built at MIT because computer industry did not exist at the time. It was basically the first modern computer. It was the first computer to use ICs. And at its peak of the research, they used 60% of all chips in the United States, which is incredible. And also, it was the first time that a computer actually held lives in its hand. If this thing failed, everyone on board would die, without question. And so it was a big deal. Now, the problem was that they needed to have memory to record programs and data like we have RAM in our computers. The problem was that memory did not exist at the time. We hadn't invented it yet. And so they used this thing called rope memory. It looks like that, which should concern you because that doesn't look very high-tech, and it wasn't. It was literally woven between ferromagnetic cores. If it was inside the core, that was a 1. If it was outside, it was 0, which is a ridiculously ghetto way of doing memory. To write a program, just to program something, you have to figure out how it's all configured and then send it to a factory and then wait like 2 months and then you get the program back. And you better hope that it works. It was not good. The total memory was 70 kilobytes of memory compared to gigabytes on this computer. So basically, you could say that this pocket calculator had probably more computing power than the entire Apollo guidance computer. So just try to get to the moon using this. That was the challenge that they had, and it actually worked. Now, a final note is that they actually didn't trust the guidance computer to do a really good job, so they included a sextant in the command module. It's somewhat fitting that even on the trip to the moon, that these astronauts would use the same method of navigation as sailors had for thousands of years. And it actually worked quite well, apparently. So, we made it. The fact that we made it is somewhat remarkable, and I want to summarize it real quick. This is what it takes to go to the moon. We strapped astronauts on top of the most powerful machine ever built, a skyscraper packed with explosives designed by ex-Nazi scientists in rural Alabama, guided by a computer 100,000 times less powerful than your cell phone, on board a completely untested spacecraft to go farther than any human being had ever gone before. And it all worked. But it wasn't without any sort of hitches, actually. At the very end, they had the computer crash. Like, it started getting really angry. It started flashing all these warnings. And literally with 15 seconds left in the fuel tank, they had to decide whether to land or to abort, realizing that if they landed and the computer did not work or wouldn't restart correctly, they would all die. If they waited too long, there wasn't enough fuel, and they would all die. And if they decided to abort the mission and the computer was really broken, they would also all die because they couldn't actually get back to Earth. It was a big deal. But fortunately, the computer managed to restart correctly, which maybe is like the first time that someone had a problem with the computer crashing and it actually restarted correctly. So finally we got to this moment where Neil Armstrong landed on the moon and took the first steps. It's hard to overstate how important this moment was to people at the time. 600 million people watched this live. It was the largest television audience ever, which is maybe even more remarkable because only 200 million televisions existed at the time of this occurrence. 93% of Americans were watching this live. It is the most shared moment in all of history. At no other time have more human beings been doing the exact same thing than the moment that Neil Armstrong set foot on the moon. Pretty incredible. Another further note is that when they decided to take back off, Buzz Aldrin accidentally literally broke off the restart switch to the whole thing. He straight up with his suit tore it off of the command module. So they finally figured out a way to use a pin to jam in there and then flick the switch back on to restart the reignition sequence. So they almost died that way. And then when they were launching back up, this is something that most people don't know either, is that they knocked the flag down. It was too close to the command module, and so the jet blast just knocked it over. It's gone. So the question still remains, why did we go to the moon? Now, I think the proper way to say this is actually not talk about Apollo 11, but talk about Apollo 8, which at the time was even a more significant occurrence. Apollo 8 was the first time that we went around the moon. It was the first time that humans rode the Saturn V rocket, and it was the first time we escaped Earth's orbit. And it mattered because 1968 was a really rough year. The Tet Offensive in Vietnam marked the worst part of the war. There were American soldier massacres going on. It was a really dark time in Vietnam. There were race riots throughout the country and riots throughout the world. MLK was assassinated. Bobby Kennedy was assassinated. It was one of the worst years in American history. And there's something about a rocket going to space that really resonated with people. And so Apollo 8 became a very important moment. Perhaps most of all, Apollo 8 was the first time that a human had ever left sight of Earth. When they orbited through the dark side of the moon, they could not see Earth for the very first time. And because of that, it was the first time that they saw Earth again for the first time. And this is what they saw, if this loads correctly. They saw the Earth rise above the horizon of the moon. And it was so incredible that they forgot about their mission and actually started just taking pictures of it. It was a really deeply impactful moment. And even more so, they found out that they were going to give a broadcast on Christmas Eve. And they were told by NASA that they'd be seen by more people than any other time in the world, only broken by Apollo 11. This is the second most watched thing ever. And they asked what to do. And NASA responded, just do whatever seems appropriate. It was completely open-ended, up to the astronauts. And so on Christmas Eve 1968, as families on Earth gathered, many missing a son in Vietnam, they reflected upon a violent, tumultuous, and hateful year. And they listened to a broadcast of 3 lonely astronauts that were farther away from Earth than any human had ever been. Those astronauts could have chosen many things, but instead they chose to say the one thing that was appropriate for the moment. They begin to read from Genesis 1. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth, and finished the whole chapter. It is somehow fitting that in the most impressive technical moment in our history, the astronauts could only turn to Genesis to appropriately describe the moment and their feelings. Their astronauts were named Times Men of the Year for this occasion. They were credited for saving the year because it was so impactful. NBC News anchor David Brinkley put it this way: as the human race, without many victories lately, had one today, and it will be remembered as long as the human race lasts. It was deeply, deeply impactful for the people of Earth in a dark and troubled year. But the question still remains, why did we go to the moon? Well, I think we went to the moon not because it was an achievement, but because it was the greatest work of art we have ever produced. Like art, the Apollo program is irrational. There is no practical value to art, but it provides something that is inherent to our very nature: to create beauty, to understand our role on Earth, and to see the very fingerprints of God. In the words of Neil Armstrong, it suddenly struck me that this tiny pea, pretty and blue, was the Earth. I put up my thumb and shut one eye, and my thumb blotted out the planet Earth. I didn't feel like a giant. I felt very, very small. For a moment, the Apollo program captured the attention of the entire world, unlike any event before or since. Not because of the value of going to the moon, but because for the first time it allowed humans to see the greatest masterpiece ever created, that of the Earth itself. Thank you.